In beginning, I'd like to acknowledge the Tuvalu and Yagara people, traditional owners of the country on which the gallery is situated, a meeting place for many people across the region. Many of you will know this is Kurilpa, named for the water rat, and there's beautiful stories of actual water rats, but also kind of mythic narratives weaving the lives of people, the water life, the animal life of this site together over many, many generations. And this is something that Megan Coates' beautiful work, Reformation, does very powerfully, I think, at the opening of the exhibition. So a really important energy stretching a long way back into this site. And in Megan's work also taking us into the future, I think the future that we all need to make and think about together and gather our energies towards. So important to pay those respects, and thank you all for being here to join us with excitement today. It's been a great privilege for me to develop this exhibition, Water. At the outset, I thought I've been reading a lot of water-related books over many years, and inappropriately quoting Moby Dick for decades. And it might have seemed that would be the perfect circumstance in developing this exhibition, but I'd actually picked up a really great book by Peter Godfrey-Smith, which we have here, and we want to spruik a little bit. Other Minds, the Octopus and the Evolution of Intelligent Life. And it was a fantastic inspiration for me in developing the exhibition. I suppose this is a theme that so many artists are drawn to and passionate about and represent in their practice. And I knew that we needed to kind of represent that in the structure of the exhibition, but also to kind of find unexpected links and inspiration and go deep into the subject. Something I love with Other Minds is that Peter takes us on this journey back through the history of evolution and this sense of first life beginning from water, these cellular structures building and multiplying, developing in complexity, and looks at this early point when the kind of common mutual ancestor to ourselves and octopus existed. And I'll get him to talk a little bit later on about when that was, and then this long kind of branching and diversity that occurred subsequently. But then his experience of kind of, and our experience in a way, of looking at a creature like an octopus in the water, looking at their behaviours, studying how they relate, and that we do have a sense of mind, and that we can kind of, connect in a way. And, one of the great insights of that book I felt was, just this idea that a mind has developed almost kind of independently twice in the history of evolution. And for me, this sense of water as pulsing with many possible connections and opportunities was really rich. Also things about how we might, this point in evolutionary history where as soon as awareness occurred, eyes and, there's certain kinds of senses, we also develop mechanisms to defend each other and attack and predate. So that our connectedness and potential to work together occurs at the same time as we're kind of eating each other up. So I felt that was a really interesting metaphor to perhaps carry forward to this point in time as we think about the challenges of working together to address climate change. How do we really mobilise our energy and potential for innovation, everything we see in our next generations, but all the wisdom and knowledge that we need from every point of life. So So yeah, I found it a really amazing and inspiring book. So it's an honour to have Peter on our panel here today. That was a semi-deep dive, but what I might do is I'm going to do a quick introduction to our panel members and then just open with a little kind of intro on each artist's practice. So I have Vera Möller here with me, and yeah, I'll just keep it brief for the moment. Peter Godfrey-Smith, Angela Tiatia and Joyce Campbell. So welcome. It's powerful and beautiful to have you all here. And Vera, if I can begin with you, we have 2 works of yours in the exhibition, in some ways similar, in some ways very different. There's your work, Vestibulia, in the vestibule, as it were, by chance, and maybe design, as we enter the gallery with all the beautiful underwater forms, and then another beautiful work, Kahilalia, within the body of the exhibition, as it were. Would you like to say a little bit about the role of water and the observation of the life within water and how that has fueled your practice?
I've got a background in biology. I studied freshwater ecology in Germany. My specialty was gathering water samples from Bavarian lakes. This is a long time ago, nearly 100 years. And when I started my practice as an artist, I looked at all of that subject matter again. I literally fell in love with the Great Barrier Reef, but also with the southern coast, with the Great Southern Reef that maybe you're not so familiar with. And then I decided that all of that was potent subject matter to work with and to articulate it within a creative practice. So my job, as I've defined it now for myself, is to bring attention to what goes on in these spaces and to do it in a way where I hopefully seduce children and grown-ups into looking at certain populations that you might find there, visual phenomena that you might find there. And it's a bit of trickery sometimes, but it's a seduction job. I would like you all to go and look at it and maybe learn about it. And once you start to learn about it, you can't help but feel great empathy, and then you are a voting person in Australia, and you know what your job should be. And I think I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah. And Vera, maybe I'll just round out with a few more questions as well, if you don't mind. Like, can you tell us a little bit about where you're living at Flinders and the reef there? And
I was born on the North Sea area in Germany and finally weaseled my way all around the globe to the southernmost tip of Victoria. So I live at the end of my road. There is the Mushroom Reef. It's a basalt reef. So I go down there all of the time and look what is living there, from luring octopus to all sorts of other phenomena. And I go kayaking. I do fish from my kayak. And it means that I spend big amounts of time just in quiet observation. And I get to see weedy sea dragons, all sorts of other sea life. I see seagrass beds, and I can now know if they are healthy or not. So it's a quiet observation time. And that's something that I recommend to all of you too. So this particular piece that sits in that illuminated box is actually about air roots of mangroves. Just like here in the Brisbane River, where you have mangroves and you see the air roots coming out. They are very important mechanisms for the mangroves to exist in these muddy tidal zones. They are incredibly important in terms of being nurseries for fish, for practically any sea life you can think about, bird life as well. So we need to protect those zones, and I try to find a way of just bringing your attention to the complexities of it. So I never illustrate any work, as I haven't done in that work, but I try to play around with it. And I've borrowed from corals and their bioluminescence to insert these fluorescent tops. So now you can see that it looks like an organic Los Angeles, when you fly into LA, you see a grid system, and this to me looks like a city underwater.
And you were, as well as the mangroves, you were inspired by the work of Ramon y Khalil?
Yes. He was a Spanish neuroscientist. I can't speak Spanish, but I say it. Santiago Ramon y Cajal. It's very, very beautiful. And he drew from brains. He dissected brains and created drawings of neural pathways. And that, to me, is so beautifully connected to what we've talked about here. And so as an artist, I try to bring various references together, and eventually then a work forms out of that. And maybe a last word on the work in the entrance. It's really a fantasy. It's an underwater sponge garden, but it has no reference to anything specific. I just like for children especially to be attracted to the forms, and it seems to work. I saw a kid running in the other day and say, "Coral gardens," and so really I try to tread a very careful path between sort of kitsch on the Gold Coast, if you know what I mean, and I don't see that without respect to artisans at all, but I try to run a practice where I hover right in between something that's very alien and maybe sometimes quite threatening, and something that's very seductive, highly contrasted and full of patterns that you can actually observe. I think that's probably...
And you had, you've got communities there, but also some interesting individuals. Do you want to pick out a favourite individual to just tell us?
Yes, I will, Geraldine. You know about my fascination with nudibranchs. Do you know what nudibranchs are? That's your homework. You've got to go home and find out what these little sea slugs do. They're the most beautiful creatures. They are bottom feeders. They have very different mechanisms biologically that I don't need to go into. But they too, we can observe them now dropping down further into the south. So scientists that work in Darwin, there's a specialist, a nudibranch specialist. They research how now our climatic changes and the different temperatures of waters bring populations of different species down with them. And so they can be used as indicators as well. But some of them look like female lingerie underwear. They're so frilly and beautiful and transparent. Otherwise look like little sea snakes, highly patterned. They're then usually toxic. And look, I better stop, because once I talk about nudibranchs,
Well, maybe that's also a good segue, Peter, to return to you. And you're also a very keen observer of underwater life in the world, and I'm sure you've seen many nudibranchs, but the octopus, and would you like to talk a bit about that role of observation, and then in relation to how your thinking and more philosophical patterns of framing have evolved?
Sure. Yeah, it's tempting to just take up the nudibranch baton from Vera here and say more about them, but I'll resist that and try to be a bit more general for a while at least. Look, it's such a pleasure to have some involvement in this thing. So many of my interests are brought together in an event like this. The book that Geraldine mentioned earlier really was sort of born of a kind of reconnection with water. I grew up in Sydney and had the normal kind of beach-ish life that many Sydney kids had, but then went to the US and spent most of my professional life in the US in different universities. And even though quite a bit of that was in California, in much American life, there's not the same kind of, I think, ongoing and immediate connection that ordinary people have with the marine environment around them. And then about 15 years ago, I began coming back to Australia more often, just on visits, especially during the summer holidays, and found myself spending a lot more time in the water, especially around Manly, just north of Sydney. And that reconnection had two sides to it. Firstly, I began to think about just the role of water in relation to life and the evolution of the mind, but in particular, the octopus was the animal that focused a lot of these interests, because I came across the animals unexpectedly. First, actually, giant cuttlefish rather than octopus. Octopus, often they're looking at you and you don't know that they are. They're masters of camouflage, whereas a giant cuttlefish is like this enormous traveling drive-in movie screen, often in the water. And when I encountered them, I realized I was in the presence of something really extraordinary and that I should try to understand, just in its own right. Then found that there was this remarkable set of evolutionary relationships that Geraldine mentioned also earlier, where all living things on Earth, and all animals in particular, share common ancestors. You have a great, lots of greats, grandparent in common with your dog, with a fish, with that tree outside. There's a tree-shaped network that connects all of life on Earth. But some of those relationships are very deep in time. So if you ask what was the most recent common ancestor that you share with an octopus, you have to go back about 600 million years, which is not a long time in the history of the Earth, but it is a long time in the history of animal life. That's a big chunk of the history of animals that was separate in evolutionary terms between the path leading to us and the path leading to them. And the book Other Minds is really focused around that relationship, the fact that octopuses are quite smart animals, sensitive animals, there's a lot going on inside them, but they're so far from us in evolutionary terms. And that was the genesis of that particular project. But as I said in the beginning of these remarks, I think there's a broader set of facts about the importance of water in relation to creativity, in relation to our thinking about our place on the Earth, what kind of beings we are, what kind of thing life is, and still resisting the temptation to say something about nudibranchs. Right. I'll hand on. But it really is a delight to be part of an exhibition that has those kinds of themes, the relationship between creativity and water in particular, at their heart.
Thanks, Peter. And I was just thinking, it's incredible because Other Minds, you were saying to me earlier, like it was just anticipated to be a smaller project, but it's now translated into 20 languages and available around the world. You've got about a year off your next book, but you've got this sequence of 3 books, and I hope, just tell me if you don't want to go there, but you were mentioning it's kind of like looking at the next one, looking at other animals, but then widening the net with the third, but also coming to consider aspects of climate change. And would you be able to give us like a little teaser for that
Sure,
journey?
Yeah. So the second book, which will be out about 11 months from now, most likely, will be called Metazoa. So Metazoa is an old-fashioned word for the animal kingdom. And whereas Other Minds was organised around that very particular fact about the history of animal life, that sort of Y-shaped structure where you have a common ancestor leading to us and leading to octopuses, that's just part of the larger tree. And the second book is opening out and looking at much more of the tree. There's a long discussion of fish, crustaceans, corals, the transition to land, the kind of interesting changeover that occurred. So if you go back through the history of the Earth, the point at which there's a transition from most of the action being in the sea to most of the action being on land is fairly recent in the following sense. Up until about 100 million years ago, which is during the sort of dinosaur period, even within the time that there was some stuff on land, most of the action was in the sea. And then about 100 million years ago, suddenly the land became, in a way, the new locus of creativity. You suddenly had a lot more species, a lot more ways of living, and these very intense energy flows, which are in part due to the evolution of flowering plants, like most of the plants around us now. So that second book brings us up to the point and sort of hovers around the stage when there's that transition from animal life being mostly marine to being largely on land. And then the third book, which will be called Living on Earth, as you say, is partly about continuing the story and working out how we got to the particular peculiar place where we find ourselves now, but also partly working out, how we should approach the future and our position and our role on the Earth. My microphone's about to fall off. That's better. Yeah. How we should think about the naturalness of human intervention in climate systems, what kind of role we have as agents on the Earth as well as merely inhabitants. So that will be the third set of themes. That's a fair way off yet. I would say something like 3 years from now, the third book.
That idea of agency, I think, is something I was really interested in this exhibition as well, and maybe like a reason with, I think you get it in different levels in different works, maybe more clearly in like William Forsyth's work, the finding of the path, but also there's a pathfinding in Olafur Eliasson's work.
I think of Forsyth's work. When I look at that, I think about, one of the things I think about is the transition from life in the sea to animal life on land, just trying to sort of exist and move and act in this quite different medium from the medium in which animal life originally evolved.
Yeah, and Angela, agency is interesting to me in relation to your work because, your beautiful video piece, Holding On, we have you there kind of using your body on the kind of concrete plinth out into the ocean. And in a way it could just seem like any old high tide, but both the works that we're showing of yours were filmed in Tuvalu. And can you tell us a bit about the genesis for the projects?
My heritage is Samoan, and I spent a lot of my childhood growing up in Samoa, going to school there, being in village life, and then going from Samoa to New Zealand and then to Australia. And so it was a really interesting thing, like returning to Samoa and then slowly seeing this change happening within the environment. So the first thing I noticed was the erosion on the beachfront, because my village is probably about 500, my house is 500 meters from the beach. And it's a beautiful, idyllic beach, like what you'd imagine paradise to be. And I was really fortunate to grow up there and to call that my home. So, the palm trees, there's a nut tree, huge old nut trees, and, white sand and beautiful turquoise water, and then just slowly seeing these changes, and then my family starting to talk about it. And so I remember when I was 15 that my family in New Zealand, in Auckland, and my mum decided to pull us all together and say, listen, there's something that's happening and we don't really know what it is, but we need to do something. And that was, makes me really emotional. And that was to build a stone foundation on our land to kind of deal with the water that was coming in and affecting our land. And so the purpose of the meeting was, look, us as separate families will form a joint bank account, and every week we'll put in $5 to $10, whatever we can afford. And the aim is to save $30,000 so that we could build the stone platform. And then like a year later, my older sister said, but that's not going to stop the water. And then so we were like, what? And then so we abandoned the whole project. And then in 2010, returning to Samoa and just seeing the devastation, like it was really serious. My backyard was now just mud and sludge, like all the beautiful trees that we relied on for food was just no longer there. And so that kind of made me start to go, because at the time we had no language for climate change, we had no understanding of what it was. I was like, what is going on? And then slowly this joining into the language and the words for climate change, what was happening, and then the overall system, making those links. And then I was like, well, I feel like I needed like a sense of duty to make a work that was, because at the time there was lots of documentaries, like lots of documentary makers from Europe going to Tuvalu or in other parts of like Kiribati, and making documentaries about how serious climate change was affecting village life and the people there. And then, so I was like, I was just like, I feel like there needs to be like a really beautiful poetic response to what is happening. And so that was the seed for creating Holding On. And so I went to Tuvalu, and my reason for going to Tuvalu, even though I'm Samoan, is because it is 2.5 meters above sea level. It's one of the most in crisis in the Pacific, alongside Kiribati, and that Samoa and Tuvalu have a really strong historical and ancestral ties, a lot of historical intermarriage, and that carries on to this day, and that the language is really similar. And so I was in Tuvalu, and I just kept thinking, and in conversation with the Tuvaluans, when I would ask them about climate change, the response back would either be really scientific and really goal-focused, like, look, we have no exit strategy, the whole world needs to be on board with keeping this as our home, or it was complete denial where God would not let this happen to us, God's going to save us. And so I just kept looking at that concrete plinth and going, well, what is the most iconographic image of salvation out there? And that's Christ on the cross. And so I was like, well, what if there is an alternative subverted image of the brown female body offering an alternative image to the audience where she's upside down? It's the upside down crucifix. And perhaps there is a way for all of us to delve into Indigenous and First Nations knowledge of how we used to preserve and be as in holistic living with the environment as well as with ourselves. So that was the whole seed for it.
Yeah. In a way, yeah. And I was really struck. I mean, I love there's kind of a difference and a similarity in a way in both of those works, because then the 3-screen work, Tuvalu, I found it incredibly poignant that there's a quietness about the observation, and this observation of the waters bubbling up and the waves moving over the edges. It's like this incredibly devastating drama playing out, and the kids are still playing, and the lady's in her front yard. It's, how do you go, is it a natural language to you between observing and acting? Like, it's challenging for all of us, I think, to find a way to meet the kind of urgency and the impact, but how do we share that in a public space? Probably haven't really framed the question very clearly there, but I think there's a quiet observation in your work, but a passion about these devastating things that are occurring. How do you want to even talk about your more recent work? I'm thinking, Angela, like do you keep going with, you've chosen to make a work more in a studio context, haven't you? Do you want to say a little bit about that? Because I'm thinking that's an interesting further language in your practice to continue the issues, but find other ways to explore them.
Yeah. It was funny, after making Tuvalu and Holding On, and there was another work that I did on Tuvalu, I sort of removed myself from the whole thing and thought, that's it. I think I've said what I wanted to say about climate change. I think that's the work that can just sit on its own and be viewed by the public, and then I can go and venture out and do other things. But there's always a return to water. So say, for example, my work that was shown earlier this year called Narcissus was, again, bringing into contemporary times and context that bringing forward that myth of Narcissus who falls in love with his own image and is unaware of what's happening around his surroundings. And so I thought, isn't that such a compelling image for our modern times, where we're so consumed with our phones and just looking into this black mirror that we're just so oblivious or not wanting to see or denying what's happening around us. And so, and then that there's like a large group of people that are being so consumed by the image that they all fall into the water. And so, I think that theme keeps coming up, is that we need to have that observation of our surroundings, that it will cause us to hopefully act in small ways that we can make a difference, for these challenging times.
Yeah, it's a wonderful part of being a curator is, encountering any artwork, but also seeing an artist's practice unfold and seeing this kind of, through commitment of motifs, but also these moments of reinvention and re-energizing of a language and possibility. And Joyce, maybe I might throw to you, and in fact the mirror that Angela referred to kind of gives us a nice little segue into your daguerreotypes of the series Te Taniwha. So, working with a very ancient medium, but can you tell us a little bit about the daguerreotype in your practice, but also share with people the story of how Te Taniwha came to be?
Sure. The daguerreotype was invented in 1839, so it's one of the two first sort of registered photographic inventions. So I use a whole range of photographic techniques right through to digital video, but my intentions around working with particularly daguerreotype and ambrotype is to point really specifically to that moment when modernity struck, right? And the modern project and the colonial project struck, both in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and also in California, two places that I've lived. So I've worked with those kinds of technologies in environments that were traumatised by the modern colonial project, and working with these technologies that I think you immediately, as soon as you see them, you recognise that these are not of this time. So if you get to see the Te Taniwha work, if you actually reach over and look in deeply, you'll just see your own face. That's the nature of a daguerreotype. It's really a polished silver surface that's been activated by iodine, and a very kind of subtle white powder has been deposited on the surface, and that's all that you're seeing is that white powder reflected against the black of the room and of the velvet. I work in this particular instance in Te Renga, and my collaborator Richard Nenia is in the audience today. You made it back, thanks Richard. Richard is the knowledge holder and kaitiaki and caretaker really of an entire very, very deep time narrative around a sacred deity, the Taniwhahine Korako, that lives in the Te Renga Gorge, which is what all those images are of.
Yeah. And this is where you grew up, isn't it? Not where you live now, but where you grew up.
I grew up in the neighbouring valley, and so our family's closest friends lived up that valley, and we used to journey through what was always self-evidently to me an extremely, I want to call it a sacred wellspring. It felt very strongly like that to me as a child. I would feel myself entering into what was very viscerally to me a sacred place, and then we would kind of drive out of it. So for me, to be honest, it's a lifelong privilege to be able to work in a space that I understand to be utterly sacred. Tiny and very specific, and loaded with a deep well of human spirit and sentient spirit in relation to the eel in particular, the longfin eel. So in this space, I was really struck, Peter, by something that you were saying, which is that, needless to say, all of evolutionary time is a tree, and that we have ancient ancestral connections to every living thing on Earth. That biological truism, I guess, is embedded quite specifically in Ngai Kohatu self-identification, and Richard could say a lot more about this than I could, but it is absolutely explicit to Ngai Kohatu, the hapu, the extended family network that live in that particular site, that everybody who lives there is directly descended from an albino eel called Hinikorako, who is a sacred water deity. That's built into the larger self-identification, and I think if you regard that both as an explicit biological story, but also just sort of a deep and clear understanding of the roles that we play in relation to other sentient beings. It's just sitting there in the self-understanding. And there are many paths to that understanding, and clearly you're finding, your path, your publication, it finds this parallel in Ngai Kohatu understanding, which is interesting to me. So, well, more than interesting, really
Joyce,
powerful.
can I do a little track back as well? So when, if people find the right angle to view the daguerreotype, and you've made these cases so they sit horizontally on a long shelf, and as per an older traditional daguerreotype, there's a little case with velvet. And can you describe what you see when you get that right angle?
So if you look from a normal standing angle, and it's beautifully installed, I must say, so you see a photographic image, you see a dark pool of a photographic image, and you see a whole series of images of the Wairakaina, which is the Taringa Gorge, which in this narrative was created by the body of a taniwha who split the earth to make this space. And you see a series of eels, which are photographs of eels in tanks, not in the water, I must say. That would have been technically beyond me. And so if you stand from a normal viewing position, you see that. But if you lean into the image, you'll see your own face on top of that image, because what you're really looking at is simultaneously a mirror and a photograph, a very primitive form of photograph. So for me, working with that kind of technology takes you right to the crux, or the moment when the colonial project hit the place where I grew up. The 1840s, the 1850s, the 1860s were extremely tumultuous period in that part of the world. And in fact, some of the most successful resistance to the colonial project happened in the Taringa Valley. When the Prophet Te Kooti moved through that valley and brought with him a very sophisticated form of what we might call guerrilla warfare in resistance to the land grabs of the colonial project. So there's a very, very rich historical narrative in the valley. There's an extremely rich mythological narrative. But underpinning all of that is the taniwha herself, who is an eel, who has a 22 million year history of negotiating the oceans and fresh water of various parts of the earth, if that makes sense.
And I think it's also important and very beautiful that you're here with Richard, and it's an unusual thing and a tender thing that as Pākehā, non-Maori, but you've, with Richard, kind of created this project together and been given the care. We had the wairua yesterday that you developed, Richard, and delivered. And so to tell this story together is a beautiful mark of trust, to share the story.
It would indicate a huge amount of trust on Richard's part, which I want to thank him for. We are actually connected not by blood, but by love in terms of family. So we do have actually quite deep familial connections, although, as I say, they are connections of friendship and love rather than blood. But I would also say...
It's profound, isn't it? It's the most profound connection, isn't it?
And I think that's where where Richard's, I hope Richard's trust in me comes from, because the bottom line is we face... These narratives are clearly powerful. They're also clearly not mine. But this task isn't necessarily a shared one. It's just too big to handle, to engage with alone. So as a Pākehā New Zealander, it would be maybe easier politically to step back and do my thing over here. But I come from a part of the country that I owe a lot to, and I think our stepping forward and our collaborating over many years is indicative of the necessity for all in, really. What Richard says is, if you can do the job, do the job. We need someone to do the job. If you can do, am I paraphrasing for you? But you've said that to me in the past.
Yeah.
Yep, fair to say. And there are lots of jobs to be done. And in our part of the country, there are many tasks to be done. There's not a lot of economic resource, and there is a lot of economic pressure on waterways in particular. So we've actually spent the morning sort of strategising the next phase of our project and talking about the ways in which practical action and a kind of deeper gathering of oral histories and image making and the like will what we're going to pursue. We just kind of spent some time this morning on this. Yeah.
Fantastic.
To think that through.
And maybe, I mean, it's almost an impossibly challenging question to share with the panel, but I think it's also something that, for me, in thinking of the framing of this exhibition, that question of what needs to be done and what can we contribute creatively and through thinking. For us here at the gallery, this is a big building, a majestic building. We're funded by government to bring many different people here together. We'd like to be a place for conversation and debate, but we're facing urgent questions, and I think we also need a place for poetry and beauty, but I'd love to hear from you about how you guys all feel about this balancing of what moves your soul, how do we work creatively, and how do we also deal with those urgencies. I know you've addressed it a little, Angela, but would any of you like to pick that one up?
I'll go for it.
Yeah.
I see in my own new community in Flinders that people start to want to do things, and they're firstly very, very localised, but it has to do with becoming engaged, let's say, in bird watching, watching the waders that come down there. And I only use it as an example. There are many ways where you can actually talk to your friends and learn about your own waterways, learn what lives there, why it is in the condition that it is in, and you find very, very quickly you can't help yourself but to get into action, and you will give that action direction. And there are many, many experts everywhere that you can look to. One of the things that I really like about your book is it is not just theoretical, but you give us all of these observations of going to Octopolis. And one of the great ways of how education can be delivered is that it's not just theoretical, but you firstly connect it with your place. And that's the way to start, and I can't tell you how you do that, but you will feel compelled. We all know what the weather does now. We have the smoke, we know the absence of water, the complete deluge of waters. It is a massive task for all of us, but we all live here, we live in our places, and we are responsible. And I think that's something that we all share about what we do as artists. We try to reframe, as Oliver said so very powerfully in his keynote. And the museum can be a place where you don't just look at stuff, you don't just respond to conceptual backgrounds and poetic, beautifully delivered projects that are very, very, they often ask you to be very quiet and spend time and let it wash over you, just like water does. But these places are public spaces, and you should really feel encouraged to learn more about everything. And I think that's all I need to say about action. action is required. That's what I feel very, very strongly.
Yeah, I liked Bill Forsyth, whose work, The Fact of Matter with the Rings, is in the centre of the space here. He talks about the body as a thinking tool, but one of these aspects of this work is to kind of destabilise it and ask us to test and try different things as we move through the space.
I think one of the most potent things we can do as individuals is because our government is so in denial, that we have to act on a grassroots level, so that's all of us together. And that's the only way that we can accomplish this, is that not one person is doing everything perfectly, but we do things on a mass scale together imperfectly, and that way I think will make massive change. And so the number one thing we need to focus on is the fossil fuel industry and keeping that in the ground. And so down to our super, we need to have in our own personal lives an active divestment strategy. So if you have super that invests in fossil fuels, that's where you're getting your money, your interest paid into your accounts, that you need to look at other alternatives, other super companies that have green investment strategies, accessing the solar panel industry, and looking at ways that we can become more self-reliant and lowering our carbon footprint. And so I think diverting our energy into keeping fossil fuel into the ground, I think that would be the most potent and the most what do you call it, potent?
Big impact of,
that we can make.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like, it's fascinating seeing things happening with hydrogen energy. One thing that interested me with Trevor Paglen's work in the exhibition, which we've been kind of thinking of as a portrait of the internet via the undersea cables, he was interested in exposing the kind of unseen systems that support our connection and communication with each other. I loved this idea of this long history of pulsing kind of energy and signals relaying between us, represented in these cables. But as we were writing about it, and I was thinking, it's only in the 1980s that optical fibre cables were invented, but now they just, string the earth many times over. And so it is incredible what we can do, human beings, to, make these unlikely inventions and, do something like keep a snowman frozen here in tropical Brisbane in the middle of summer. Which of course is an artwork that comes with power consumption. So there are a lot of dilemmas for us about how do we make a point? How do we kind of order all the tools and capacities at our disposal and deal with a very enormous problem that really has only just begun to express itself in a way.
One thing I was struck by, Angela, when you're describing your work on Narcissus and the cables, is that it is in fact those cables that are providing this black mirror into which we all stare. It seems to me that your question was a little bit, how can we, when there's all these huge serious problems, be thinking about art? I think of what we do essentially as the philosophy of object and image. And if we are not in a moment of extraordinary addiction to object and image, which is in fact driving us into that hole, then what are we in? So our task really is...
Is this the selfie moment? Is this the selfie moment?
Right. But I mean, it's institutions like this that get to take a radically interdisciplinary approach to that fundamental philosophical question, right? What is an object? What is an image? What does it do? And if nobody's asking that question, we're just in, we just go on and we're in, right? Nobody's observing anything. So except for ourselves.
I mean, one reason I was really pleased to be able to include Peter Dombrovskis's work in the exhibition, and his photograph Morning Mist, Rock Island Bend, that became key to the campaign to resist the plans to dam the Franklin River. He's an amazing artist and photographer, and really committed to being out there in the natural world, seeing the beauty in it and observing its patterns and movements. But I suppose in a sense it was also the take-up of that image. And
Do you know that image was known in Germany? It went all the way around the globe and activated some people to come here to protest. I remember it very well.
Yeah. And it's
It was everywhere at that time. It was around 82 or something like that. Yeah, that photograph, I mean, younger people here might not appreciate quite how ubiquitous that one photograph was at that time. Everywhere you turned, there was that photograph of that river bend, and the message was always unambiguous. Everyone knew exactly what was being said by that photograph. So it was really an unusually potent piece of art historically.
Yeah. And I suppose it's interesting to think of the image, isn't it? You've got this, cliffs in the landscape, this central tower of rock, the deep waters of the Franklin moving through, and in the publication I kind of also had a slightly linked reference to Leonardo da Vinci's drawings of water and those kind of eddies and currents, but then the beautiful sun kind of coming up and just the golden edges. It's amazing how the poetry of one image can then come to carry so much emotion for all of us. And I think this exhibition, the idea of water, it's something that is a vehicle for emotion in incredible ways, isn't it? And maybe on that note, if you could join me first in thanking our panel of artists and Peter.